a single kill. What was done to God goodness. But yeah. Doing that you get kind of
hello. Hello, hello, hello. How are we all today? Oh, wait, I've got to do one thing. Not that. There we go. Got that working now. That should be the closed captions set up for the people that need them. How are we all today? Are we all ready for some story time? Hopefully my microphone's working as it should be. I did some fiddling around with settings to put on a noise filter. So I can, in theory, still have things like my desk fan going or my window open if it's too warm. And it won't get in the way. And also get rid of some of those traffic noises from outside. They get rather loud and rather excessive. So hopefully it's picking me up fine still, and I can still talk. Hey Salvi, hey Judas. I see Erica came in as well, just to steal first and then leave for the meeting. And Plantia and Keith are here. How are we all? Hope you're all doing well. Ah, there's a bat on my screen. Oh wait, Sav. Hey Sav. Hey Keith. Hopefully my mic's working fine and picking up sound and all that fun stuff. Ah, some love hearts. Cute. Trying to get people's thoughts on the intro song. I mean, I like it. Mike is good. Good. So as I've said, I am asking people not to do sound redeems because I will disable them all if need be, but I'd really rather not have to because it means setting them back up again. But we've got two short stories here, neither of which I've read. So we can read through them. And then afterwards, in honour, I guess, of Sucker for Love and doing the Esther route, I think, as they call it, in that, we will be starting to read The King in Yellow, which I've checked is public domain because I'm still not 100% sure where Twitch lies on reading copyrighted material and broadcasting it. Because Twitch is weird. So we can keep this all as much public stuff as we can, please, till I'm certain. So everyone, I hope you've got yourselves a nice drink. I hope you've got yourselves maybe a snack or a blanket. And you're comfy. I am somewhat tempted to maybe play some nice fireplace noises or something cozy like that, but I'm not sure how well that would translate to the back rooms. I really do need to get a different background at some point for this. Oh well. Rain? Rain could be good. Looping rain, let's see. How's that? Hopefully I can still be heard over it. Backrooms is on fire. I mean, as long as it's soothing noises to get you into the mood. But, can you hit me alright over it? Can I be heard? Brain is a bit too loud compared to me. Let's turn you down a bit more. How's that? Is that better? Hopefully that's better. Hopefully it's not quite as loud as it was now. Let's just lower that down a little bit. Much better? That's good. There we go. Got some nice rain in the background, which is always peaceful and soothing. So let's start with... Make sure we've got the right thing open there. And we're reading The Forest Heart first by Claire Lewis. She took her first breath in a grove of towering aspen trees, under the shadow of a hummingbird's wing. Her mother was the melody of the mountain stream, and her father was the glitter of sunlight through the coin-shaped leaves. The forest cared for her, swaddled her in wildflowers, and sustained her with birdsong. When she cried, the butterflies kissed her cheeks and dried her tears. She grew strong and fast, and it was only a few years. She was taller than the saplings that sprouted on the day of her birth. When the nights were cold, she slept beside the fawns, curled up against their spotted backs while their mother sang lullabies and told stories. On warm spring evenings, she lay on beds of moss and sweet-smelling fallen leaves. She played with the bluebirds, who taught her to sing. She raced the coyote pups along dry stream beds. On rainy days when the earth smelled of sky, she wandered down the mountain lake and swam with the river otters. She lived a contented life for many years in the little grove. The woods and the mountainsides loved her dearly, knew the sound of her footsteps and the touch of her fingers. Even the most fearsome creatures were tame in her presence. The bears told her where to find the sweetest honey. The chorus of wolves sang her dirges in hollow harmony, hoping to see her smile. Even the mountain lion tipped his regal head in her direction as he stalked by in search of prey. She was the forest's very heart. One day, she awoke to strange sounds in the woods. Voices, clumsy and ill-defined, not lofty like birdsong or steady like a doe's murmur. She climbed to the top of the old pine tree, who straightened with joy at her touch. A man and his son rambled through the woods, snapping limbs from sapling trees and tramping larkspur underfoot. The man was tall and thin, and the boy stood about the girl's height, with a smile cool as a riverbed stone. She watched all day from a distance as they cleared a space in the aspen grove to make camp, gathered wood, made a fire, pulled fish from the lake with a stick and string, and roasted them over flames. When the night fell, the forest held a hushed conference about the strangers. The nervous squirrels chittered, the bucks stamped their hooves, and the owls quieted everyone down to warn them. No one was to go near the trespassers, especially not the girl. The next morning, the girl licked dewdrops from the wild mint leaves and wandered the woods, avoiding the spot where the man and his son lay sleeping. She hummed to herself as she walked and did not notice the boy, who had risen at the sound of her song and followed it. "What's your name?" he asked as he approached, and the forest grew deathly still. The girl did not have a name. She did not know what names were. There were no use to such things in the forest, for the creatures knew one another too intimately for names. "Your name?" he asked again, slowly. She shrugged. He frowned. "I'm Liam." "Liam," she replied, letting the word fall from her tongue like overripe berries from a vine. He nodded and stepped towards her, hand outstretched. In his palm rested a hand-carved wooden rabbit, one of the most beautiful and strange things she'd ever seen. Hesitantly knowing that the disapproving trees were watching, she snatched the rabbit from him and dashed away, vanishing into the woods. The man and his son stayed in the grove one more day. Neither caught a glimpse of the girl at that time, and the man was quite convinced that his son had dreamed her. But Liam knew the truth, and so did the forest. After the trespassers left, the girl clung tightly to the wooden rabbit, and whispered her wishes in its ear. The creatures in the forest told her to forget the boy, begged her to join their games. For weeks she could not bring herself to do either. A year passed, and somewhere in that time the girl nearly forgot Liam. She left the wooden rabbit under the old pine tree. She played once more with the otters and sang with the sparrows. The forest was whole again, whole and happy. And then Liam and his father returned. This time, the girl was bolder and met Liam in the grove while his father fished down at the lake. He didn't look up from the fire when she appeared. He only smiled in the gentle flames. "I knew you were real," he whispered. She smiled back. Liam and his father returned to the woods once every spring. Each year, much to the forest's chagrin, Liam and the girl stole a moment together beneath the shade of the pine branches, nestled in the scent of the fallen needles that clung to their skin. They talked and they laughed. The girl came to love speaking in Liam's clumsy language, just as he came to love how well she knew the forest, how deeply she belonged to it. The third year they met, Liam stole a kiss from the girl under the pine tree. The fourth year, the girl stole 2 kisses, and Liam stole a caress of the girl's wildflower skin. One day, after many years of stealing kisses, they stole much more from one another, and lingered in the shade of the pine tree in a breathless reverie. Shortly after that day, Liam and his father departed the woods again. The girl fell ill. The forest did not scold, only sighed at the inevitability of it all, and nursed her as best as it could. In time she grew better and stronger. She grew fuller too, and felt the terrifying exhilaration of life within her. She bore a child under the shade of the aspen trees, a daughter with wildflower skin and eyes full of wishes. The girl gave her daughter the little wooden rabbit to play with, and when spring came, the 2 of them waited under the pine tree for Liam's return. When he did return, this time without his father, his cool smile did not last long. His countenance grew darker at the sight of his daughter sleeping in a bed of pine needles. He knew that this child, like her mother, was not human, not quite, and the knowledge made him tremble. Liam could not hear the girl's voice over the sound of fear rushing in white rapids within his ears. He raged, more at himself than at the girl, but the forest heard and bristled at his fury. The girl did not weep, did not plead as he turned and started back down the mountainside. She simply picked up her daughter and left the shade of the pine tree for the last time with a soft goodbye. The girl could forgive and forget, but the forest could not. Liam did not make it down the mountain. When the girl had discovered what the forest had done, she went out in search of Liam's body, thinking she might bury the man she loved under the pine tree where she loved him. She left her daughter beside the thorns in the tender care of the aspen grove where she was raised, promising to return. She searched for days. The forest could not tell her where he lay, so she wandered in aimless grief. With gentle chirps, the birds cautioned her to go back to her daughter. The wolves invited her to add her loss to their somber song and allow herself to heal. The mountain lion said nothing, merely nuzzled her hand and pointed her home. Still, she did not stop searching for Liam. The forest wept for her with her bitter tears of regret and love. When she found him lying in a field of larkspur and thistles, with his eyes open to the sun, she stood over him with tears in her eyes. The very heart of the forest lay down beside the man she loved and did not rise. Year after year, and even to this day, all the creatures of the forest gather at the edge of the field in early spring. They bring with them the girl's daughter to show her the wildflowers which bloom over the place where her parents lie. That was a nice one. That was really nice, actually. A drink, a tea. First one that you read for Rowie. It was nice. It was very soothing, actually. I hope I did it justice for you all. I hope you enjoyed that and that there was no no interference with the microphone, or the honking outside didn't get picked up with the microphone. Because there was a lot of honking out there for part of that. I hope that wasn't too distracting. You would have better. Thank you. Thank you for saying so, Judas. So what did people think of that one? Did they like it? Did they... I mean, I know Judas's opinion of this one, as Judas was the one who recommended it. But I'm curious as to if anyone else has opinions and thoughts. What do you think the girl was feeling at the end there? What do you think Liam was feeling? I mean, he was angry, but... What do you think the daughter feels? I guess that's the nice part of stories, and the worst part is... Hey Looper, how are you? Hope you're enjoying your day. Thank you for dropping in. I just got finished with the first story. I think they all fell asleep because you have the soothing voice. Thank you, Judas. Doing okay, just keep reading. I'm washing up as we speak. Fair enough. Please praise me more. It's excellent. But we're going to move on to the next story. Cigarettes, a Romance by Howard Halsall. This one does contain a sensitive content, so if any of you are what's the word I'm looking for? Unprepared for that, please bear that in mind. When I saw that warning, I did have a quick skim. Didn't read it, but I do see that it does feature a loss in some way. I'll say the death of a loved one. Without hopefully spoiling it too much, but I would like people to have that warning there, due to the nature of it, and this being in theory a cozy stream, so I don't want to blindside people with that too much. I remember our first cigarettes together with the Rothmans. Middle tower, with a filter, of course. It was 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, and we were attending a local church's youth club disco. I recall that she'd gone outside for a breath of air. God, I could do with a gasper, she said, avoiding my gaze, as if we were on stage and I'd forgotten my lines while searching for a prop. I groped down inside my black jacket for my pack of Rothmans. My awkward fumbling attracted her attention, and she smiled as I raised my head. She moved closer and caught my eye as I flipped the lid to reveal a double row of cigarettes, lined up like coffin nails wrapped in silver paper. Do you have the convenience of a light? She'd asked, helping herself. No, I didn't, I said, punching a cigarette between my lips, turning my pockets inside out to show my jacket, to show my lack of a handy incendiary. Typical, she said, rolling her eyes and leaning towards me. My jaw all but fell open as she raised her slender hand toward my face. Never mind, she said, I'll improvise. Her outstretched thumb and forefinger plugged the smouldering cigarette from my lips. The manoeuvre was gentle but precise and practiced, as if she was removing a milk tooth from under a sleeping infant's pillow. Her studied gesture was one of ritual, full of expectation, belief, and mystery. She was both a nocturnal light-fingered fairy with a delicate touch, and a kind spirit exchanging a child's fang for a silver sixpence. My cigarette, now resting between my lips again, took on an unearthly quality, blessed by her soft caress. I watched her drawing the smoke into her lungs. The world stopped spinning and I felt dizzy, waiting for her to exhale. "I needed that," she said, allowing the white plume to drift over her shoulder. "I'm Virginia, by the way." I returned her smile as my face blanched, the smoke having gone down the wrong way. "Don't forget to breathe out," she said, grinning, "or you'll die coughing." And at that moment I was hooked. I've given up smoking 1,000 times. It's easy. No, really, it is, I promise. It's a question of perseverance. I don't mind, and they don't matter. That's what they say, isn't it? In the past, I stopped smoking for days, and often as long as a week. When we were young, there was no reason to cease. Besides, after years of dedication, it was easy to continue than to quit. When Virginia died, though, I was bereft. She made me promise to quit when I was by her bedside. I visited her in hospital, and she had tubes everywhere and an oxygen mask, which she removed from time to time to have a quick puff. She insisted on me pushing her wheelchair outside for a breath of fresh air. Once we were away from the matron's watchful glare, she'd rifle through my pockets, spark up, and have a good wheeze and a cough. Virginia smoked until the last hours of her life. She was ever faithful to the pleasure that killed her. We'd had 50 years of marriage, golden years and many, many happy times, and no regrets. I'd never smoked much before I met Virginia. Well, not every day anyway. All my pals smoked, and I tried it with little success. They told me it was what adults did, and I ought to try harder. I persevered until I reckoned I'd got the hang of it. Gaspers, she used to call them. "Can I nick a Gasper?" she'd ask when we got to know one another. She smoked Benson and Hedges, and soon changed my allegiance. It was easy if we both smoked the same brand. The night we met, I'd marched into a local tobacconist, clutching the correct money in coins, and asked for a pack of 20. It was my first packet of 20, and I only bought them to feel grown up. I didn't even have money for a lighter. I had to ask someone for a match to light one, like the one I was holding when she spoke to me. Virginia had caught my eye about town, and I'd seen her smoking. I thought I could impress her if I smoked too. If she encouraged me to smoke in the first place, it seemed fitting that she should ask me to stop after her departure. While sharing a cigarette, we fixed all our problems together. Whatever came our way, we would fight it until the end. We were invincible as a couple, and inseparable too. A match made in heaven. Virginia and I laughed our way through life's troubles. We never argued until we tried to give up smoking at the same time. I'd had a health scare, and she suggested packing in. Going to cold turkey is awful, and we almost ended our relationship in divorce. After a week, I'd had enough of a respite, and started smoking again. I was soon on top form and felt fit again. The breather restored my health, and we turned to our ways soon after. But what about the expense, I hear you say? It's funny how you can always find money for cigarettes when you're a smoker. It doesn't matter how tough things are, you can buy another pack. My Uncle Jim was a big smoker in the 70s. He enjoyed anywhere between 30 to 40 cigs a day. It was an era when smoking was encouraged and tobacco companies offered many incentives. They gave tokens away with every packet. The idea was to collect them and choose gifts in exchange. Uncle Jim collected 7,000 cigarettes tokens of various denominations, hoping to claim a new car. He counted them out, gathered them up in a dozen boxes and sent them off. It's funny, but he heard nothing back from the cigarette company. When he called them, they said the tokens must have got lost in the post. Uncle Jim couldn't believe it. According to my aunt, he hurled the telephone through the enormous picture window. The loss didn't deter Uncle Jim, however. He just continued to smoke an alternative brand of tobacco. I overheard my family discussing the issue, and they asked the inevitable question regarding his expenditure. What would Uncle Jim do with the money if he had it all again? Uncle Jim just shrugged, he said, and said he had all the money he'd spent on cigarettes. He'd have spent it all on cigarettes. It made little sense to me as a youngster, and the waste horrified me. Now I'm not so sure. He enjoyed a cigarette, and I can understand that up to a point. He didn't die of cigarettes, and he had a happy life. As a social shorthand, it's great for making friends. Can I pinch your ciggy? Would you like one of mine? Have you got a light? Inevitably, such questions lead to longer conversations at work or at a party. I've made many friends and acquaintances that way. When Virginia got ill and had to rest in the hospital, I rationed myself to 14 cigarettes a week. 2 a day, 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening. Some days I'd get to 10:30 and I'd allow myself a second cig. Then by lunchtime, I'd struggle not to have a third. Most days I'd finish 10 cigarettes by afternoon and pretend I'd done well. After all, I could have smoked a pack of 20 with ease. In the evening, I'd buy more for the next day and smoke by the end of the night. During my last visit to the hospital, Virginia asked me in a whisper if I had a light. "I'm sorry, love," I said, biting my lip, as my eyes turned with salty tears. "I haven't got a light," I said. "Didn't you know I've given up?" "Typical," she said, her voice rasping behind the mask. "I'll have to improvise." Almost a year has passed since she made me promise to stop with her last gasp. I've kept my promise for 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4.5 days. Just thinking about our life together makes me miss her so much. It's difficult to forgo the two most precious things in one's life. Losing both at the same time is heartbreaking. Virginia and cigarettes go together. In my mind, I can't separate them. And God, I could do with one now. The end. That was Cigarettes, a Romance by Howard Halsall. That was, you weren't wrong, that one was quite sad. But it was really nice and quite tender, I think. The SBM? What's the SBM? Progressive black metal. Yeah, I can guess the S. It's funny what things you just associate with another person, and you just can't separate those things from the person. And it does make you wonder, if that person was no longer around, would you be able to carry on with those things that you had tied up with them? I'm glad I read that. That was a nice one. Yeah, especially if, given that kind of circumstance, Judas, I can imagine. And that is definitely one that I would recommend. And thank you for listening to me read that one. What I do have now, though, is a physical book. We're going to change tract a little bit. This is one that I own myself, and I can just kind of have it in front of me, bookmarked. Literally bookmarked, not web bookmarked. And just read it. So we're going to get on with that. The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink beneath the lake, the shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies, but stranger still is lost Carcosa. Song that the Hades shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead, die thou unsung as tears unshed. Thou shalt dry and die in lost Carcosa. Isildur's Song in The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2. Chapter 1. The Repairer of Reputations. Toward the end of the year 1920, the government of the United States had practically completed the program adopted during the last months of President Winthrop's administration. The country was apparently tranquil. Everyone knows how the tariff and labour questions were settled, the war with Germany, incident on the country's seizure of the Samoan Islands, had left no visible scars upon the Republic, and the temporary occupation of Norfolk by the invading army had been forgotten in the joy over repeated naval victories and the subsequent ridiculous plight of General Van Gartenloob's forces in the state of New Jersey. The Cuban and Hawaiian investments had paid 100%, and the territory of Samoa was well worth its cost as a coaling station. The country was in a superb state of defence. Every coast city had been well supplied with land fortification. The army, under the parental eye of the General Staff, organised according to the Prussian system, had been increased to 300,000 men, with a territorial reserve of 1 million, and 6 magnificent squadrons of cruisers and battleships patrolled the 6 stations of the navigable seas, leaving a steam reserve amply fitted to control home waters. The gentleman from the West had at last been constrained to acknowledge that a college for the training of diplomats was as necessary as law schools are for training of barristers. Consequently, we were no longer represented abroad by incompetent patriots. The nation was prosperous. Chicago, for a moment paralysed after a second great fire, had risen from its ruins, white and imperial, and more beautiful than the white city which had been built for its plaything in 1893. Everywhere good architecture was replacing bad, and even in New York, a sudden craving for decency had swept away a great portion of existing horrors. Streets had been widened, properly paved and lighted, trees had been planted, squares laid out, elevated structures demolished, and underground roads built to replace them. The new government building and barracks were fine bits of architecture, and the long system of stone quays which completely surrounded the island had been turned into parks which proved a godsend to the population. The subsidising of the State Theatre and the State Opera brought its own reward. The United States National Academy of Design was much like European institutions of the same kind. Nobody envied the Secretary of Fine Arts, either his cabinet position or his portfolio. The Secretary of Forestry and Game Preservation had a much easier time thanks to the new system of National Mounted Police. We had profited well by the latest treaties with France and England, the exclusion of foreign-born dunes as a measure of self-preservation, and the settlement of the new independent state of Swanee, and checking of immigration, the new laws concerning naturalisation, and the gradual centralisation of power in the executive all contributed to national calm and prosperity. When the government solved the issues with Native Americans, and squadrons of Native American cavalry scouts in native costume were substituted for the organisation tacked onto the tail of skeletonalised regiments by a former Secretary of War. The nation grew a long sigh of relief. When, after the colossal Congress of Religions, bigotry and intolerance were laid in their graves and kindness and charity began to draw warring sects together, many thought the millennium had arrived, at least in the New World, which, after all, is a world by itself. But self-preservation is the first law, and the United States had to look on in helpless sorrow as Germany, Italy, Spain and Belgium writhed in the throes of anarchy, while Russia, watching from the Caucasus, stooped and bound them one by one. In the city of New York in the summer of 1899 was signalled by the dismantling of the elevated railroads. The summer of 1900 will live in the memories of New York people for many a cycle. The Dodge statue was removed in that year. In the following winter began the agitation for the repeal of the laws prohibiting suicide, which bore its final fruits in the month of April 1920, when the first government lethal chamber was opened on Washington Square. I had walked down that day from Dr. Archer's house on Madison Avenue, where I had been as a mere formality. Ever since that fall from my horse 4 years before, I had been troubled at times with pains in the back of my head and neck, but now for months they had been absent, and the doctor sent me away that day saying there was nothing more to be cured in me. Hey, Sir Christus, thanks for dropping by. Why are you unfollowed? I don't know. Why are you unfollowed? How dare you? But not to worry, Twitch can be weird sometimes. It was hardly worth his fee to be told that. I knew it myself. Still, I did not grudge him the money. What I minded was the mistake which he had made at first. When they picked me up from the pavement where I lay unconscious, and somebody had mercilessly sent a bullet through my horse's head, I was carried to Dr. Archer, and he, pronouncing my brain affected, placed me in his private asylum where I was obliged to endure treatment for insanity. At last he decided that I was well, and I, knowing that mine had always been as sound as his, if not sounder, paid my tuition, as he jokingly called it, and left. I told him, smiling, that I would get even with him for this mistake, and laughed heartily, and he asked me to call once in a while. I did so, hoping for a chance to even up accounts, but he gave me none, and I told him I would wait. The fall from my horse had fortunately left no evil results. On the contrary, it changed my whole character for the better. From a lazy young man about town, I had become active, energetic, temperate, and above all else, ambitious. There was only one thing which troubled me. I laughed at my own uneasiness, and yet it troubled me. During my convalescence, I bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred gate and fell upon the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it. But as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read it and reread it, and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me. For I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, where the twin suns sink in the lake of Hali, and my mind will bear for ever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed the world with his beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth, a world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. When the French government seized the translated copies that had just arrived in Paris, London, of course, became eager to read it. It is well known that the book spread like an infectious disease. From city to city, from continent to continent. Barred out here, confiscated there, denounced by press and pulpit, censored even by the most advanced of literary anarchists. No definite principles had even been violated in those wicked pages, no doctrine promulgated, no convictions outraged. It could not be judged by any known standard, yet although it was acknowledged that the supreme note of art had been struck in the Kingdom Yellow, all felt that human nature could not bear the strain, nor thrive on words in which the essence of purest poison lurked. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterwards with more awful effect. It was, I remember, the 13th day of April 1920 when the first government lethal chamber was established on the south side of Washington Square, between Worcester Street and South Fifth Avenue. The block, which had formerly consisted of a lot of shabby old buildings used as cafes and restaurants for foreigners, had been acquired by the government in the winter of 1898. French and Italian cafes and restaurants were torn down. The whole block was enclosed by a gilded iron railing and converted into a lovely garden with lawns, flowers and fountains. In the centre of the garden stood a tall, small white building, severely classical in architecture, and surrounded by thickets of flowers. 6 Ionic columns supported the roof, and a single floor was made of bronze. A splendid marble group of the Fates stood before the door, the work of a young American sculptor, Boris Yvain, who had died in Paris when only 23 years old. The inauguration ceremonies were in progress as I crossed University Place and entered the square. I threaded my way through the silent throng of spectators, but was stopped at 4th Street by a cordon of police. A regiment of United States Lancers were drawn up in Hollow Square around the lethal chamber. On a raised tribune facing Washington Park stood the Governor of New York, and behind him were grouped the Mayor of New York and Brooklyn, the Inspector General of Police, the Commandant of the State Troops, Colonel Livingston, military aide to the President of the United States, General Blount, commanding at Governor's Island, Major General Hamilton, commanding the garrison of the New York and Brooklyn, Admiral Buffy of the Fleet of the North River, Surgeon General Lansford, the staff of the National Free Hospital, Senators Wise and Franklin of New York, the Commissioner of Public Works. The Tribune was surrounded by a squadron of hussars of the National Guard. 1 second. Bit of a cough there. The Governor was finishing his reply to the short speech of the Surgeon General. I heard him say, "The laws prohibiting suicide and providing punishment for any attempt at self-destruction have been repealed. The Government has seen fit to acknowledge the right of man to end an existence which may become intolerable to him through physical suffering or mental despair. It is believed that the community will be benefited by the removal of such people from their midst. Since the passage of this law, the number of suicides in the United States has not increased. Now that the government has determined to establish a lethal chamber in every city, town, and village in the country, it remains to be seen whether or not that class of human creature from whose desponding rants new victims of self-destruction fall daily will accept the relief thus provided." He paused and returned to the white lethal chamber. The silence in the street was absolute. There a painless death awaits him who can no longer bear the sorrows of this life. If death is welcome, let him seek it there. Then quickly turning to the military aide of the President's household, he said, "I declare the lethal chamber open." And again, facing the vast crowd, he cried in a clear voice, "Citizens of New York and the United States of America, through me the government declares the lethal chamber to be open." The solemn hush was broken by a sharp cry of command. The squadron of hussars filed after the governor's carriage, and the lancers wheeled and formed along Fifth Avenue to wait for the commandment of the garrison, and the mounted police followed them. I left the crowd to gape and stare at the white marble death chamber, and crossing South Fifth Avenue, walked along the western side of the thoroughfare to Bleecker Street. Then I turned to the right and stopped before a dingy shop which bore the sign, "Hawberk, Armourer." I glanced at the doorway and saw Hawberk busy in his little shop at the end of the hall. He looked up, catching sight of me, cried in a deep, hearty voice, "Come in, Mr. Castaigne." Constance, his daughter, rose to meet me as I crossed the threshold, and held out a pretty hand, but I saw the blush of disappointment on her cheeks, and knew that it was another Castaigne she had expected, my cousin Louis. I smiled at her confusion and complimented her on the banner she was embroidering with a colourful plate. Old Hawberk sat riveting the worn greaves of some ancient suit of armour, and the ting, ting, ting of his little hammer sounded pleasantly in the quaint shop. Presently he dropped his hammer and fussed about for a moment with a tiny wrench. The soft clash of the mail sent a thrill of pleasure through me. I loved to hear the music of steel brushing against steel, the mellow shock of the mallet on thigh pieces, and the jingle of chain armour. That was the only reason I went to see Hubert. He had never interested me personally, nor did Constance, except for the fact of her being in love with Lewis. This did occupy my attention, and sometimes even kept me awake at night, but I knew in my heart that all would come right, and that I should arrange their future as I expected to arrange that of my own kind, Dr. John Archer. However, I should never have troubled myself about visiting them just then, had it not been, as I say, that the music of the tinkling hammer had for me this strong fascination. I would sit for hours, listening, and when a stray sunbeam struck the inlaid steel, the sensation it gave me was almost too keen to endure. My eyes would become fixed, dilating with the pleasure that stretched every nerve almost to breaking, until some movement of the old armourer cut off the rays of the sunlight. Then, still thrilling secretly, I leaned back and listened to the sound of the polishing rag. Swish, swish, rubbing rust from the rivets. Constance worked with the embroidery over her knees, now and then pausing to examine more closely the pattern in the coloured plate from the Metropolitan Museum. "Who is this for?" I asked. Hubert explained that in addition to the treasures of armour in the Metropolitan Museum, of which he had been appointed armourer, he also had charge of several collections belonging to rich amateurs. This was a missing greave of a famous suit which a client of his had traced to a little shop in Paris on the Quai d'Orsay. He, Hubert, had negotiated for and secured the greave, and now the suit was complete. He laid down his hammer and read me the history of the suit, which traced since 1450 from the owner to owner until it was acquired by Thomas Stainbridge. When his superb collection was sold, this client of Hubert bought the suit, and since then the search for the missing greave had been pushed until it was, almost by accident, located in Paris. "Did you continue the search so persistently without any certainty of the greave being still in existence?" I demanded. "Of course," he replied coolly. Then for the first time I took a personal interest in Hubert. "It was worth something to you," I ventured. "No," he replied, laughing. "My pleasure in finding it was my reward." "Have you no ambition to be rich?" I asked, smiling. "My one ambition is to be the best armourer in the world," he answered gravely. Constance asked me if I had seen the ceremonies at the Lethal Chamber. She herself had noticed the cavalry passing up Broadway that morning, and had wished to see the inauguration, but her father wanted the banner finished, and she stayed at his request. Did you see your cousin, Mr. Castaigne, there?" she asked with the slightest tremor of her soft eyelashes. "No," I replied carelessly. "Lewis's regiment is manoeuvring out in Westchester country." I rose and picked up my hat and cane. "Hey, Crimson and Cane, how are you two?" "Are you going upstairs to see the lunatic again?" laughed old Hubert. If Hubert knew how I loathed the word lunatic, he would never use it in my presence. It rouses certain feelings within me which I do not care to explain. However, I answered him quietly. "I think I should drop in and see Mr. Wilde for a moment or two." "Poor fellow," said Constance, with a shake of her head. "It must be hard to live alone year after year, poor, crippled, and almost demented. It is very good of you, Mr. Castaigne, to visit him as often as you do." "I think he's vicious," observed Hubert, beginning again with his hammer. I listened to the golden tinkling greave plates. When he had finished, I replied, "No, he is not vicious, nor is he in the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber, from which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our life to acquire." Hubert laughed. I continued a little impatiently. "He knows history as no one else could know it. Nothing, however trivial, escapes his search, and his memory is so absolute, so precise in detail, that were it known in New York that such a man existed, the people would not honour him enough." "Nonsense," muttered Hubert, searching on the floor for a fallen rivet. It is nonsense, I asked. Is it nonsense, I asked, managing to suppress what I felt. Is it nonsense when he says that the tassets and cuirass of the enamelled suit of armour, commonly known as the Prince's Emblazoned, can be found among a mass of rusty theatrical properties, broken stoves and ragpickers' refuse in a garret in Paul Street? Hubert hammer fell to the ground, and he picked it up and asked, with a great deal of calm, how I knew that the tassets and left cuirass were missing from the Prince's Emblazoned. I did not know until Mr. Wilde mentioned it to me the other day. He said that they were in garret of 998 Pell Street. Nonsense, he cried, but I noticed his hand trembling under his leather apron. Is this nonsense too? I asked pleasantly. Is it nonsense when Mr. Wilde continuously speaks of you as the Marquise of Avonshire? And Miss Constance... I did not finish, but Constance had started to her feet with terror written on every feature. Hubert looked at me and slowly smoothed his leather apron. That is impossible, he observed. Mr. Wilde may know a great many things. About armour, for instance, and the Prince's Emblazoned, I interposed, smiling. Yes, he said, continued slowly. About armour, also, and maybe, but he is wrong in regard to the Marquis of Avonshire, who, as you know, killed his wife's traducer years ago and went to Australia, where he did not long survive his wife. Mr. Wilde is wrong, murmured Constance. Her lips were blanched, but her voice was sweet and calm. Let us agree, if you please, that in this one circumstance, Mr. Wilde is wrong. How are we? This is actually kind of a pain to get my mouth around some of these words. Jeez. Sip my drink here. Lots of English language words in orders that I'm not used to trying to read. At least, like, not used to trying to say out loud. Jesus. Let's have a little sippy. That is a little loopy wave. A little wave from the looper. Back from the washing. Oh, welcome back, Luffy. Chapter 2. I climbed the 3 dilapidated flights of stairs, which I had so often climbed before, and knocked at a small door at the end of the corridor. Mr. Wilde opened the door and I walked in. When he had double-locked the door and pushed a heavy chest against it, he came and sat beside me, peering up into my face with his little light-coloured eyes. Half a dozen new scratches covered his nose and cheeks, and the silver wires which supported his artificial ears had become displaced. I thought I had never seen him so hideously fascinating. He had no ears. The artificial ones, which now stood out at an angle from the fine wire, were his one weakness. They were made of wax and painted a shell pink, but the rest of his face was yellow. He might better have revelled in the luxury of some artificial fingers for his left hand, which was absolutely fingerless, but it seemed to cause him no inconvenience, and he was satisfied with his wax ears. He was very small, scarcely higher than a child of 10, but his arms were significantly developed, and his thighs as thick as any athlete's. Still, the most remarkable thing about Mr. Wilde was that a man of his marvellous intelligence and knowledge should have such a head. It was flat and pointed, like the heads of many of those unfortunates whom people imprison in asylums for the weak-minded. Many called him insane, but I knew him to be as sane as I was. I do not deny that he was eccentric. The mania he had for keeping the cat and teasing her until she flew at his face like a demon was certainly eccentric. I never could understand why he kept the creature, nor what pleasure he found in shuttering himself up in his room with his surly vicious beast. I remembered once glancing up from the manuscript I was studying by the light of some tallow dips, and seeing Mr. Wilde squatting motionlessly on his high chair. his eyes fairly blazing with excitement, while the cat, which had risen from her place before the stove, came creeping across the floor right at him. Before I could, she had flattened her belly to the ground, crouched, trembled, and sprang into his face. Howling and foaming, they rolled over and over on the floor, scratching and clawing until the cat screamed and fled into the cabinet. And Mr. Wilde turned over on his back, his limbs contracting and curling up like the legs of a dying spider. He was eccentric. Mr. Wilde had climbed into his high chair, and after studying my face, picked up a dog-eared ledger and opened it. Henry B. Matthews, he read, bookkeeper with Weiser and Company, dealers in church ornaments, called April 3rd, reputation damaged on the racetrack, known as a welcher. Reputation to be repaired by August 1st, retainer $5. He turned the page and ran his fingerless gloves down the closely written columns. P. Green Dusenbury, minister of the Gospel, Fairbeach, New Jersey. Reputation damaged in the Bowery. To be repaired as soon as possible. Retainer $100. He coughed and added, called April 6th. Then you are not in need of money, Mr. Wilde, I inquired. Listen. He coughed again. Mrs. C. Hamilton Chester of Chester Park, New York City, called April 7th. Reputation damaged at Dieppe, France, to be repaired by October 1st. Retainer $500. Note: C. Hamilton Chester, Captain USS Avalanche, ordered home from South Sea Squadron October 1st. Well, I said, the profession of a repairer of reputation is lucrative. His colourless eyes sought mine. I only wanted to demonstrate that I was correct. You said it was impossible to succeed as a repairer of reputations, that even if I did succeed in certain cases, it would cost me more than I would gain by it. Today, I have 500 men in my employ who are poorly paid, but who pursue the work with an enthusiasm which possibly may be born of fear. These men enter every shade and grade of society. Some even are pillars of the most exclusive social temples. Others are the prop and pride of the financial world, and still others hold undisputed sway among the fancy and the talent. I chose them at my leisure from those who reply to my advertisements. It is easy enough, they are all cowards. I could treble the number in 20 days if I wished. So you see, those who have in their keeping the reputations of their fellow citizens, I have in my pay. They may turn on you, I suggested. He rubbed his thumb over his cropped ears and adjusted the wax substitutes. I think not, he murmured thoughtfully. I seldom have to apply the whip, and then only once. Besides, they like their wages. And how do you apply the whip? I demanded. His face for a moment was awful to look upon. His eyes dwindled to a pair of green sparks. I invite them to come and have a little chat with me, he said in a soft voice. A knock at the door interrupted him, and his face resumed its amiable expression. Who is it? He inquired. Mr. Stilett, was the answer. Come tomorrow, replied Mr. Wilde. Impossible, began the other, but you were silenced by a bark from Mr. Wilde. Come tomorrow, he repeated. We heard somebody move away from the door and turn the corner of the stairway. Who was that? I asked. Arnold Stilett, owner and editor-in-chief of the great New York Daily. He drummed on the ledger with his fingerless hand, adding, I pay him very badly, but he thinks it's a good bargain. Arnold Stilett, I repeat, amazed. Yes, said Mr. Wilde, with a self-satisfied cough. The cat, which had entered the room as he spoke, hesitated, looked up at him and snarled. He climbed down from the chair and squatted on the floor, took the creature into his arms and caressed her. The cat ceased snarling and presently began a loud purring which seemed to increase in timbre as he stroked her. Where are the notes? I asked. He pointed to the table, and for the 100th time I picked up the bundle of manuscript entitled The Imperial Dynasty of America. One by one, I studied the well-worn pages, worn only by my own handling, and although I knew all by heart from the beginning, went from Carcosa, Bicades, Hastia, and Aldebaran, to Castaigne, Luis Carvaldos, born December 19th, 1877. I read it with an eager, rapt attention, pausing to repeat parts of it out loud and dwelling especially on Hildred de Carvaldos, only son of Hildred Castaigne, and the Edith Lynns Castaigne, first in succession, etc., etc. When I finished, Mr. Wilde nodded and coughed. "Speaking of your legitimate ambition," he said, "how do Constance and Louise get along?" "She loves him," I replied simply. The cat on his knee suddenly turned and struck at his eyes, and he flung her off and climbed onto the chair opposite me. "And Dr. Archer? That's a matter you can settle any time you wish," he added. "Yes," I replied. "Dr. Archer can wait, but it is time I saw my cousin Louis." "It is time," he repeated. When he took another ledger from the table and ran over the leaves rapidly. "We are now in communication with 10,000 men," he muttered. "We can count on 100,000 within the first 28 hours, and in 48 hours the state will rise en masse. The country follows the state, and the portion that will not. I mean, California and the Northwest might better never have been inhabited. I shall not send them the yellow sign." The blood rushed to my head, but I only answered, "A new broom sweeps clean." The ambition of Caesar and of Napoleon pales before that which could not rest until it has seized the minds of men and controlled even their unborn thoughts, said Mr. Wilde. "You are speaking of the king in yellow," I groaned with a shudder. "He is a king whom emperors have served." "I am content to serve him," I replied. Mr. Wilde sat rubbing his ears with his crippled hand. "Perhaps Constance does not love him," he suggested. I started to reply, but a sudden burst of military music from the street below drowned my voice. The 20th Dragoon Regiment, formerly in garrison of Mount St. Vincent, was returning from the manoeuvres in Westchester Country to its new barracks on the East Washington Square. It was my cousin's regiment. They were a fine lot of fellows in their pale blue, tight-fitting jackets, jaunty busbies, and white riding breeches with a double yellow stripe, into which their limbs seemed moulded. Every other squadron was armed with lances, from the metal points of which flustered yellow and white pennons. The band passed, playing the regimental march, then came the colonel and staff, the horses crowding and trampling, while their heads bobbed in unison and the pennons fluttered from their lance points. The troopers, who rode with the beautiful English seat, looked brown as berries with their bloodless campaign among the farms of Westchester. Looked brown as berries from their bloodless campaign among the farms of Westchester, and the music of their sabres against the stirrups and the jingle of spurs and carbines was delightful to me. I saw Louis riding from his squadron. He was as handsome an officer as I had ever seen. Mr. Wilde, who had mounted a chair by the window, saw him too, but said nothing. Louis turned and looked straight at Hubert Sharp as he passed, and I could see the flush of his cheeks. I think Constance may have been at the window. When the last trooper clattered by, and the last pennons vanished into South Fifth Avenue, Mr. Wilde clambered out of his chair and dragged the chest away from the door. I'll fall asleep here, no lie. I'm glad my fucking up of some words isn't causing too much of an issue for you and getting relaxed. "Yes," he said, "it is time that you saw your cousin Louis." He unlocked the door and I picked up my hat and stick and stepped into the corridor. The stairs were dark. Groping about, I set my foot on something soft, which snarled and spat, and I aimed a murderous blow at the cat, but my cane shivered to splinters against the balustrade, and the beast scurried back into Mr. Wilde's room. Passing Hubert's door again, I saw him still at work on the armour, but I did not stop, and stepping out into Bleecker Street, I followed it to Worcester. skirted the grounds of the lethal chamber, and crossing Washington Park, went straight to my rooms in Benedict. Here I lunched comfortably, read the Herald and the Meteor, and finally went to the steel safe in my bedroom and set the time combination. The 3 3/4 minutes which is necessary to wait while the clock is opening are to me golden moments. From the instant I set the combination to the moment when I grasp the knobs and swing back the solid steel doors, I live in an ecstasy of expectation. Those moments must be like moments passed in paradise. I know what I am to find at the end of the time limit. I know what the massive safe holds secured for me alone, and the exquisite pleasure of waiting is hardly enhanced when the safe opens and I lift from its velvet crown a diadem of purest gold blazing with diamonds. I do this every day, and yet the joy of waiting and at last touching again the diadem only seems to increase as the days pass. It is a diadem fit for a king among kings, an emperor among emperors. The king in yellow might scorn it, but it shall be worn by his royal servant. I held it in my arms until the alarm in my safe rang harshly, and then tenderly, proudly, I replaced it and shut the steel doors. I walked slowly back into my study, which faces Washington Square, and leaned onto the windowsill. The afternoon sun poured into my windows, and a gentle breeze stirred the branches and the elms and the maples in the park, now covered with buds and tender foliage. A flock of pigeons circled about the tower of Memorial Church, sometimes alighting on the purple-tiled roofs, sometimes wheeling downward to the Lotto's fountain in front of the marble arch. The gardeners were busy with the flower beds around the fountain, and the freshly turned earth smelled sweet and spicy. A lawnmower, drawn by a fat white horse, clinked across the green sward, and watering carts poured showers of spray over the asphalt drives. Around the statue of Peter Stuyvesant, which in 1897 had replaced the monstrosity supposed to represent Garibaldi, children played in the spring sunshine, and nurse girls wheeled elaborate baby carriages, with a reckless disregard for the pasty-faced occupants, which could probably be explained by the presence of a half-dozen trim dragoon troopers, languidly lolling on the benches. Through the trees, the Washington Memorial Arch glistened like silver in the sunshine, and beyond, on the eastern extremity of the square, the grey stone barracks of the dragoons and the white granite artillery stables were alive with colour and motion. I looked at the lethal chamber on the corner of the square opposite. A few people still lingered about the gilded iron railing, but inside the grounds the paths were deserted. I watched the fountain ripple and sparkle. The sparrows had already found this new bathing nook, and the basins were covered with the dust-feathered little winged things. 1 second. I'll check how long this chapter is. Okay. 2 or 3 white peacocks picked their way across the lawns, and a drab-coloured pigeon sat so motionless on the arm of one of the fates that it seemed to be part of the sculptured stone. As I was turning carelessly away, a slight commotion in the group of curious loiterers around the gates attracted my attention. A young man had entered and was advancing with nervous strides along the gravel path which led to the bronze doors of the lethal chamber. He paused a moment before the fates, and as he raised his head to those 3 mysterious faces, the pigeon rose from its sculptured perch, circled around for a moment, and wheeled to the east. The young man pressed his hands to his face, and then with an undefinable gesture sprang up the marble steps. The bronze doors closed behind him, and a half hour later the loiterers slouched away, and the frightened pigeon returned to its perch in the arms of the fate. I put on my hat and walked out into the park for a little, went out into the park for a little walk before dinner. As I crossed the central driveway, a group of officers passed, and one of them called out, "Hello, Hildred," and came back to shake hands with me. It was my cousin Lewis, who stood smiling and tapping his spurred heels with his riding whip. "Just back from Westchester," he said. Been doing the bucolic, milk and curds, you know, dairy maids in sunbonnets who say how and I don't think when you tell them they are pretty. I'm nearly dead for a square meal at Delmonico's. What's the news? There is none, I replied pleasantly. I saw your regiment coming in the morning. Did you? I didn't see you. Where were you? In Mr. Wilde's window. Oh, Hal, he began impatiently. That man is stark mad. I don't understand why you... He saw how annoyed I was about his outburst, and begged my pardon. Really, old chap, I don't mean run down a man you like, but for the life of me I can't see what the deuce you find in common with Mr. Wilde. He's not well bred, to put it generously. He is hideously deformed. His head is the head of a criminally insane person. You know yourself he's been in an asylum. So have I interrupted calmly. Lewis looked startled and confused for a moment, but recovered and slapped me heartily on the shoulder. You were completely cured, he began, but I stopped him again. I suppose you mean that I was simply acknowledged never... I suppose you mean that I was simply acknowledged never to have been insane. Of course that's what I meant, he laughed. I disliked his laugh because I knew it was forced, but I nodded gaily and asked him where he was going. Lewis looked after his brother officers, who had now almost reached Broadway. We had intended to sample a Brunswick cocktail, but to tell you the truth, I was anxious for an excuse to go and see Hugh Buck instead. Come along, I'll make you my excuse. We found old Hugh Buck, neatly attired in a fresh spring suit, standing in the door of his shop and sniffing the air. I had just decided to take Constance for a little stroll before dinner, he replied to a impetuous volley of questions from Lewis. We thought of walking on the park terrace along the North River. At the moment, Constance appeared and grew pale and rosy by turns as Lewis bent over her small gloved fingers. I tried to excuse myself, alleging an engagement uptown, but Lewis and Constance would not listen, and I saw I was expected to remain and engage old Hugh Buck's attention. After all, it would be just as well if I kept my eye on Lewis, I thought, and when they hailed a Spring Street horse car, I got in after them and took my seat beside the armourer. The beautiful line of parks and granite terraces overlooking the wharves along the North River, which were built in 1910 and finished in the autumn of 1970, had become one of the most popular promenades in the metropolis. They extended from the Battery to 190th Street, overlooking the noble river and affording a fine view of the Jersey Shore and the Highlands opposite. Cafes and restaurants were scattered here and there among the trees, and twice a week military bands from the garrison played in the kiosks and the parapets. We sat down in the sunshine of the bench at the foot of the equestrian statue of General Sheridan. Constance tipped her sunshade to shield her eyes, and she and Lewis began a murmuring conversation which was impossible to catch. Old Hugh Buck, leaning on his ivory-headed cane, lit an excellent cigar, the mate to which I politely refused, and smiled at vacancy. The sun hung low above the Staten Island woods, and the bay was dyed with golden hues reflected from the sun-warmed sails of the shipping in the harbour. Brigs, schooners, yachts, clumsy ferryboats, the decks swarmed with people, railroad transports carrying lines of brown, blue and white freight cars, stately sound steamers, declassed tramp streeters, coasters, dredgers, scows, and everywhere pervading the entire bay, impudent little tugs, puffing and whistling officiously. These were the craft which churned the sunlit waters as far as the eye could see. In calm contrast to the hurry of sailing vessel and steamer, a silent fleet of white warships lay motionlessly midstream. Constance's merry laugh aroused me from my reverie. "What are you staring at?" she inquired. "Nothing. The fleet," I smiled. Then Lewis told us what the vessels were, pointing out each by its relative position to the old red fort on Governor's Island. "That little cigar-shaped thing is the torpedo boat," he explained. "There are 4 more lying close together. They are the Tarpon, the Falcon, the Sea Fox, and the Octopus. The gunboats just above are the Princeton, the Champlain, the Stillwater, and the Erie. Next to them lie the cruisers Farragut and Los Angeles, and above them the battleships California and Dakota, and the Washington, which is the flagship. Those 2 squatty-looking chunks of metal, which are anchored off which anchored the head of Castle William, are the double-turreted monitors, terrible and magnificent, and behind them lies the ram of solar. This feels nice to listen. Thank you. I'm glad you feel that way. Let's have a quick drink. Don't wet my mouth. Constance looked at him with deep approval in her beautiful eyes. "What loads of things you know for a soldier," she said, and we all joined in the laugh which followed. Presently Lewis rode with a nod to us and offered his arm to Constance, and they strolled away along the river wall. Hubert watched them for a moment and then turned to me. "Mr. Wilde was right," he said. "I found the missing tassets in the left cuissard of the Prince's Emblazoned, in a vile old junk garret in Pell Street." 998? I inquired with a smile. "Yes. Mr. Wilde is a very intelligent man," I observed. "I want to give him credit for this most important discovery," continued Hubert, "and I intend it shall be known that he is entitled to the fame of it." "He won't thank you for that," I answered sharply. "Please say nothing about it." "Do you know what it's worth?" said Hubert. "No, $50 perhaps. It's valued at $500, but the owner of the Princess Emblazoned will give $2,000 to the person who completes his suit. That reward also belongs to Mr. Wilde." "He doesn't want it, he refuses it," I answered angrily. "What do you know about Mr. Wilde? He doesn't need the money. He's rich, or will be, richer than any living man except myself. What will we care for money then? What will we care, he and I, when what?" demanded Hubert, astonished. "You'll see," I replied, on my guard again. He looked at me narrowly, much as Dr. Archer used to, and I knew he thought I was mentally unsound. Perhaps it was fortunate for him that he did not use the word lunatic just then. "No," I replied to his unspoken thought, "I am not mentally weak. My mind is as healthy as Mr. Wilde's. I just do not care to explain just yet what I have on hand, but it is an investment which will pay more than mere silver, gold, and precious stones. It will secure the happiness and prosperity of a continent, yes, a hemisphere." "Oh," said Hubert. "And eventually," I continued more quietly, "it will secure the happiness of the whole world. And incidentally, your happiness and prosperity as well as Mr. Wilde's." "Exactly," I smiled, but I could have throttled him then for taking that time. He looked at me in silence for a while, and then said very gently, "Why don't you give up your books and studies, Mr. Castaigne? Take a tramp along the mountains somewhere or other. You used to be fond of fishing. Take a cast or two at the trough at the Rangleys." "I don't care for fishing any more," I answered, without a shade of annoyance in my voice. "You used to be fond of everything," he continued. "Athletics, yachting, shooting, riding. I have never cared to ride since my fall," I said quietly. "Ah, yes, your fall," he repeated, looking away from me. I thought this nonsense had gone far enough, so I brought the conversation back to Mr. Wilde, but he was scanning my face again, in a manner highly offensive to me. "Mr. Wilde," he repeated. "Do you know what he did this afternoon? He came downstairs and nailed a sign over the hall door next to mine. It read, 'Mr. Wilde, Repairer of Reputations, third bell.'" "Do you know what a repairer of reputations can be?" "I do," I replied, suppressing the rage within. "Oh," he said again. Louise and Constance came strolling by and sought to ask if we would join them. Hubert looked at his watch. At the same moment, a puff of smoke shot from the casemates of Castle William, and the boom of the Sunset gun rolled over the water and was re-echoed from the highlands opposite. The flag came running down from the flagpole, and the bugles sounded over the white decks of the warships, and the first electric lights sparkled out from the Jersey shore. As I turned into the city with Hubert, I heard Constance murmuring to Lewis, something which I do not understand, but Lewis whispered "my darling" in reply, and again walked ahead with Hubert through the square. I heard a murmur of "sweetheart" and "my own Constance," and I knew the time had nearly arrived when I should speak of important matters with my cousin Lewis. Chapter 3. Or section 3, I suppose. I'm not sure how this is divided into. One morning early in May, I stood before the steel safe in my bedroom, trying on the golden jewelled crown. The diamonds flashed fire as I turned to the mirror, and the heavy beaten gold burned like a halo about my head. I remembered Camilla's agonised screams and the awful words echoing through the dim streets of Carcosa. They were the last lines in the first act, and I dared not think of what followed. Dared not, even in the spring sunshine, there in my room, surrounded with familiar objects, reassured by the bustle from the street and the voices of the servants in the hallway outside. For those poisoned words had dropped slowly into my heart, as death sweat drops upon a bedsheet and is absorbed. Trembling, I put the diadem from my head and wiped my forehead. But I thought of Hastur and of my own rightful ambition. I remembered Mr. Wilde as I had last left him, his face all torn and bloody from the claws of that devil's creature, and what he had said. Oh, what he had said. The alarm bell in the safe began to whirl harshly, and I knew my time was up, but I would not heed it, and replaced the flashing circlet upon my head. I turned defiantly to the mirror. I stood for a long time absorbed in the changing expression of my own eyes. The mirror reflected a face which was like my own but whiter, and so thin that I hardly recognised it. And all the time I kept repeating between my clenched teeth, "The day has come, the day has come," while the alarm in the safe whirled and clamoured and the diamonds sparkled and flamed above my brow. I heard a door open but did not heed it. It was only when I saw two faces in the mirror. It was only when another face rose from over my shoulder, and two of the eyes met mine. I wheeled like a flash, and seized a long knife from my dressing table, and my cousin sprang back very pale, crying, "Hildred, for God's sake!" Then, as my hand fell, said, "It is I. Lewis, don't you recognise me?" I stood silent. I could not have spoken for my life. He walked up to me and took the knife from my hand. "What is this?" he inquired in a gentle voice. "Are you ill?" "No," I replied, but I doubt if he heard me. Come, old fellow. Take off that brass crown and toddle into the study. Are you going to a masquerade? What's all this theatrical tinsel anyway?" I was glad he thought the crown was made of brass and paste, and yet I didn't like him any better for thinking so. I let him take it from my hand, knowing it was best to humour him. He tossed the splendid diadem into the air, and catching it, turned to me smiling. "It's dear at 50 cents. What's it for?" he said. I did not answer, but took the circlet from his hand and, placing it in the safe, shut the massive steel door. The alarm ceased its infernal din at once. He watched me curiously, but did not seem to notice the sudden ceasing of the alarm. He did, however, speak of the safe as a biscuit box. Fearing lest he might examine the combination, I led the way into my study. Lewis threw himself at the sofa and flicked at flies with his eternal riding whip. He wore his fatigue uniform with a braided jacket and jaunty cap, and I noticed that his riding boots were all splashed with red mud. "Where have you been?" I inquired. "Jumping mud creeks in Jersey." He said. "I haven't had time to change yet. I was rather in a hurry to see you. Haven't you got a glass or something? I'm dead tired. Been in the saddle 24 hours. I gave him some brandy from my medicinal store, which he drank with a grimace. "Damn bad stuff," he observed. "I'll give you an address where they sell brandy that is brandy." "It's good enough for my needs," I said indifferently. "I use it to rub my chest with." He stared and flicked at another fly. "See here, old fellow," he began. "I've got something to suggest to you. It's 4 years now, and you've shut yourself up here like an owl, never going anywhere, never taking any healthy exercise, never doing a damn thing but poring over those books up there on the mantelpiece." He glanced from the row of shelves. "Napoleon, Napoleon, Napoleon," he read. "For heaven's sake, have you nothing but Napoleon there?" "I wish they were bound in gold," I said. "But yes, there is another book, The King in Yellow." I looked him steady in the eye. "Have you never read it?" I asked. "I? Oh, thank God. I don't drive him crazy." I saw he regretted his speech as soon as he uttered it. There is only one word which I loathe more than I do lunatic, and that word is crazy. But I controlled myself and asked him why he thought The King in Yellow dangerous. "Oh, I don't know," he said hastily. "I only remember the excitement it created and the denunciations from pulpit and press. I believe the author shot himself for bringing forth this monstrosity, didn't he?" "I understand he's still alive," I answered. "It's probably true. Bullets couldn't kill a fiend like that," he muttered. "It is a book of great truths," I said. "Yes," he replied, "of truths which send men frantic and blast their lives." I don't care if the thing is, as they say, the very supreme essence of art. It's a crime to have written it, and I for one shall never open its pages. Is that what you've come to tell me? I asked. No, he said. I came to tell you that I was going to be married. I believed for a moment my heart ceased to beat, but I kept my eyes on his face. Yes, he continued, smiling happily, married to the sweetest girl on earth. Constance Hubert, I said mechanically. And do you know, he cried, astonished. I didn't know myself until the evening last April, when we strolled down the embankment before dinner. When is it to be? I asked. It was to have been next September, but an hour ago a dispatch came ordering our regiment to the Presidio, San Francisco. We leave at noon tomorrow. Tomorrow, he repeated. Just think, Mildred. Tomorrow I shall be the happiest fellow that ever drew breath in this jolly world, for Constance will go with me. I offered him my hand in congratulation, and he seized and shook it like the good-natured fellow he is, or pretended to be. I'm going to get my squadron as a wedding present. He rattled on. Captain and Mrs. Lewis Castaigne, eh, Hildred? Then he told me where I was to be, and who was to be there, and then we promised to come by and be best man. I set my teeth and listened to his boyish chatter without showing what I found, but I was getting to the limit of my endurance, and when he jumped up and switching his spurs till they jingled, I said he must go. I did not detain him. There's one thing I want to ask of you, I said quietly. Out with it, it's promised, he laughed. I want you to meet me for a quarter of an hour's walk tonight. Of course, if you wish, he said, somewhat puzzled. Where? Anywhere, in the park, there. What time, Hildred? Midnight. Well, what in the name of... he began, but checked himself and laughingly assented. I watched him go down the stairs and hurry away, his sabre banging at every stride. He turned into Bleecker Street, and I knew he was going to see Constance. I gave him 10 minutes to disappear, and then followed in his footsteps, taking with me the jewelled crown and silken robe embroidered with a yellow sign. When I turned into Bleecker Street and entered the door which bore the sign, Mr. Wilde, Repairer of Reputations, Third Bell, I saw old Hubert moving about in his shop, and I imagined I heard Constance's voice in the parlour, but I avoided them both and hurried up the trembling stairways to Mr. Wilde's apartment. I knocked and entered without ceremony. Mr. Wilde lay groaning on the floor, his face covered with blood, his clothes torn to shreds. Drops of blood were scattered about over the carpet, which he had also ripped and frayed in the evidently recent struggle. It's that cursed cat, he said, ceasing his groans and turned his colourless eyes to me. She attacked me while I was asleep. I believe she will kill me yet. This was too much, so I went into the kitchen and seizing a hatchet from the pantry, started to find the infernal beast and settle her then and there. My search was fruitless, and after a while I gave up and came back to find Mr. Wilde squatting on his high chair by the table. He had washed his face and changed his clothes. The great furrow which the cat's claws had ploughed up his face he had filled with collodion, and a rag hid the wound on his throat. I told him I should kill the cat when I came across her, but he only shook his head and turned to the open ledger before him. He read name after name of the people who had come to him in regard to their reputation, and the sums he had mounted were startling. I put on the screws now and then, he explained. One day or other, some of those people will assassinate you, insisted. Do you think so? He said, rubbing his mutilated ears. It was useless to argue with him, but I took down the manuscript entitled Imperial Dynasty of America, for the last time I should ever take it down in Mr. Wilde's study. I read it through, thrilling and trembling with pleasure. When I had finished, Mr. Wilde took the manuscript, and turning to the dark passage which led from his study to his bedchamber, called out in a loud voice, "Bantz!" Then, for the first time, I noticed a man crouching there in the shadow. How I had overlooked him in my search for the cat, I cannot imagine. "Bantz, come in," cried Mr. Wilde. The figure rose and crept towards us, and I shall never forget the face that he raised to mine as the light from the window illuminated it. "Bantz, this is Mr. Castaigne," said Mr. Wilde. Before he had finished speaking, the man threw himself on the ground before the table, crying and gasping, "Oh God, oh my God, help me, forgive me, oh Mr. Cascade, keep the man away, for you cannot mean it, you are different, save me, I am broken down, I was in a madhouse, and now, when all was coming right, when I had forgotten the king in yellow, and but I shall go mad again, I shall go mad." His voice died into a choking rattle. Mr. Wilde had leapt on him, and his right hand encircled the man's throat. When Vance fell in a heap on the floor, Mr. Wilde clambered nimbly into his chair again, and rubbing his mangled ears with the stump of his hand, turned to me and asked me for the ledger. I reached it down from the shelf, and he opened it. After a moment, searching among the beautifully written pages, he coughed complacently and pointed to the name Vance. "Vance," he read aloud. "Osgood Oswald Vance." At the sound of his name, the man on the floor raised his head and turned a convulsed face to Mr. Wilde. His eyes were injected with blood, his lips tumefied. "Called April 28th, continued Mr. Wilde. "Occupation, cashier in the Seaforth National Bank. He served a term of forgery at Sing Sing, from whence he was transferred to the Asylum of the Criminally Insane, pardoned by the Governor of New York, and discharged from the asylum January 19th, 1918. Reputation damaged at Sheepshead Bay. Rumours that he lives beyond his income. Reputation to be repaired at once. Retainer £1,500. Note: he embezzled sums amounting to $30,000. $1,500, not pounds. Note: he has embezzled sums amounting to $30,000 since March 20th, 1919. Excellent family and secured present position through uncle's influence. Father, president of Seaforth Bank. I looked at the man on the floor. "Get up, Vance, Mr. Wilde," said Mr. Wilde in a gentle voice. Vance rose as if hypnotised. "He will do as we suggest now," observed Mr. Wilde, and opened the manuscript. He read the entire history of the Imperial Dynasty of America. Then, in a kind and soothing murmur, he ran over the important points with Vance, who stood like one stunned. His eyes were so blank and vacant that I imagined he had become half-witted, and remarked it to Mr. Wilde, who replied that it was of no consequence anyway. I'll sip. Very patiently, he pointed out to Vance what his share in the affair would be, and he seemed to understand after a while. Mr. Wilde explained the manuscript, using several volumes on heraldry to substantiate the result of his researches. He mentioned the establishment of the dynasty in Carcosa, the lakes which connected Hasta, Aldebaran, and the mystery of the Hyades. He spoke of Casilda and Camilla, and sounded the cloudy depths of Dami and the Lake of Hali. "The scalloped tatters of the king in yellow must hide Ytil forever," he muttered, but I do not believe Vance heard him. Then by degrees he led Vance along the ramifications of the imperial family, to Urot and Thale, from Nautauba and Phantom of Truth to Aldones, and then tossing aside his manuscript and notes, he began the wonderful story of the last king. Fascinated and thrilled, I watched him. He threw up his hands, his long arms were stretched out in a magnificent gesture of pride and wonder, and his eyes blazed deep in the socket like two emeralds. Vance listened stupefied. As for me, when at last Mr. Wilde had finished, and pointing to me cried, "The cousin of the king," my head swam with excitement. Controlling myself with superhuman effort, I explained to Vance why I alone was worthy of the crown and why my cousin must be exiled or die. I made him understand that my cousin must never marry, even if renouncing all his claims, and how that least of all he should marry the daughter of the Marquis of Avonshire and bring England into the question. I showed him a list of thousands of names which Mr. Wild had drawn up. Every man whose name was there had received the yellow sign which no living human being dared disregard. The city, the state, the whole land were ready to rise and tremble before the pallid mask. The time had come. The people should know the son of Hasta, and the whole world bow to the black stars which hang in the sky over Carcosa. Vance leaned on the table, his head buried in his hands. Mr. Wild drew a rough sketch on the margin of yesterday's Herald with a bit of lead pencil. It was a plan of Hubert room. Then he wrote out the order and affixed the seals, and shaking like a palsied man, I signed my first writ of execution with my name Hildred Rex. Mr. Wild clambered to the floor and unlocked the cabinet, took a long square box from the first shelf. Then this he brought to the table and opened. A new knife lay in the tissue paper inside, and I picked it up and handed it to Vance, along with the order and the plan of Hubert's apartment. Then Mr. Wild told Vance he could go, and he went, shambling like an outcast of the slums. I sat for a while watching the daylight fade behind the square tower of the Judson Memorial Church, and finally gathered up the manuscript and notes, took my hat and started for the door. Mr. Wild watched me in silence. When I had stepped into the hall, I looked back. Mr. Wild's small eyes were still fixed on me. Behind him, the shadows gathered in a fading light. Then I closed the door behind me and went into the darkening streets. I had eaten nothing since breakfast, but I wasn't hungry. A wretched, half-starved creature, who stood looking across the street at the lethal chamber, noticed me and came up to tell me a tale of misery. I gave him money. I don't know why, but he kept away without thanking me. An hour later, another outcast approached and whined his story. I had a blank bit of paper in my pocket on which I traced the yellow sign, and I handed it to him. He laughed at it stupidly for a moment, and then with an uncertain glance at me, folded it with what seemed to be an exaggerated care, and placed it in his bosom. The electric light was sparkling along the trees, and the new moon shone in the sky above the lethal chamber. It was tiresome waiting in the square. I wandered from the marble arch to the artillery stables and back again to the Lotus fountain. The flowers and grass exhaled a fragrance which troubled me. The jet of the fountain played in the moonlight, and the musical splash of falling drops reminded me of the tinkle of chain mail in Hubert's shop. It was not so fascinating, and the dull sparkle of the moonlight on the water brought no such sensations of exquisite pleasure as when the sunshine played over the polished steel of a corselet on Hubert's knee. I watched the bats darting and turning above the water plants in the fountain basin, but their rapid, jerky flight set my nerves on edge, and I went away again to walk aimlessly to and fro among the trees. The artillery stables were dark, but in the cavalry barracks the officers' windows were brilliantly lighted, and the sally port was constantly filled with troopers in fatigue, carrying straws and harness and baskets filled with tin dishes. Twice the mounted sentry at the gates were changing while I wandered up and down the asphalt walk. I looked at my watch. It was nearly time. The lights in the barracks went out one by one, the barred gate was closed, and every minute or two an officer passed in through the side wicket, leaving a rattle of accoutrements and a jingle of spurs on the night air. The square had become very silent. The last homeless loiterer had been driven away by the grey-coated park policeman. The car tracks along Worcester Street were deserted, and the only sound which broke the stillness which was the tramping of the sentry horse and the ring of his sabre against the saddle pommel of the sentry's horse and the ring of his sabre against the saddle pommel. In the barracks, the officers' quarters were still lighted, and military servants passed and repassed before the bay windows. 12 o'clock sounded from the new spire at St. Francis Xavier, and at the last stroke of the sad-toned bell, a figure passed through the wicket beside the portcullis, returned the salute of the sentry, and crossing the street entered the square and advanced towards the Benedict apartment house. "Lewis," I called. The man pivoted on his spurred heels and came straight towards me. "Is that you, Hildred?" "Yes, you are on time." I took his offered hand, and we strolled towards the lethal chamber. He rattled on about his wedding and the graces of Constance, and the future prospects, calling my attention to his captain's shoulder straps and the triple gold arquebus on his sleeve and fatigue cap. I believe I listened as much to the music of his spurs and sabre as I did to his boyish babble, as at last we stood under the elms of the 4th Street corner and the square opposite of the lethal chamber. Then he asked me what I wanted with him. I motioned him to a seat on a bench under the electric light and sat down beside him. He looked at me curiously, with that same searching glance which I hate and fear so in doctors. Good night, Judas. I'm actually going to be wrapping this up in a page or two. So that'll be the end of the first section of the book. I felt the insult of his look, but he did not know it, and I carefully concealed my feelings. "Well, old chap," he inquired, "what can I do for you?" I drew from my pocket the manuscript and notes of the Imperial Dynasty of America, and looking him in the eye, I said, "I will tell you. On your word as a soldier, promise me to read the manuscript from beginning to end without asking me a question. Promise me to read these notes in the same way, and promise me to listen to what I have to tell later." "I promise if you wish it," he said pleasantly. "Give me the paper, Hildred." He began to read, raising his eyebrows with a puzzled, whimsical air, which made me tremble with a suppressed anger. As he advanced, his eyebrows contracted, and his lips seemed to form the word rubbish. Then he looked slightly bored, but apparently for my sake read, with an attempt at interest, which presently ceased to be an effort. He started when in the closely written pages he came to his own name, and when he came to mine he lowered the paper and looked sharply at me for a moment. But he kept his word and resumed his reading, and I left the hard-formed question die on his lips unanswered. When he came to the end and read the signature of Mr. Wilde, he folded the paper carefully and returned it to me. I handed him the notes, and he settled back, pushing his fatigue cap up to his forehead with a boyish gesture, which I remembered so well in school. I watched his face as he read, and when he finished I took the notes from the manuscript and placed them in my pocket. Then I unfolded a scroll marked with the yellow sign. He saw the sign, but he did not seem to recognise it, and I called his attention to it somewhat sharply. "It is the yellow sign," I said angrily. "Oh, that's it, is it?" said Lewis in that flattering voice, which Dr. Archer used to employ with me, and would probably have employed again, had I not settled his affair for him. I kept my rage down and answered as steadily as possible. "Listen, you have engaged your word?" I am listening, old chap," he replied soothingly. I began to speak very calmly. "Dr. Archer, having by some means become possessed of the secret of the imperial succession, attempted to deprive me of my right, alleging that because of a fall from my horse 4 years ago I had become mentally deficient. He presumed to place me under restraint in his own house in hopes of either driving me insane or poisoning me. I have not forgotten it. I visited him last night, and the interview was final." Lewis turned quite pale, but did not move. I resumed triumphantly. "There are yet 3 people to be interviewed in my interest of Mr. Wilde and myself. They are my cousins Lewis, Mr. Hubert, and his daughter Constance." Lewis sprang to his feet, and I arose also. I flung the paper marked with the yellow sign to the ground. "Oh, I don't need to tell you what I have to say," I cried with a laugh of triumph. "You must renounce the crown to me, do you hear me? To me." Lewis looked at me with a startled air, but recovering himself said kindly, "Of course I renounce the... What is it I must renounce?" "The crown," I said angrily. "Of course," he said, "I renounce it. Come on, old chap, I'll walk you back to your rooms with you." "Don't try any of your doctor's tricks on me," I cried, trembling with fury. "Don't act as if you think I am insane." "What nonsense," he replied. "Come, it's getting late, Hildred." "No," I shouted. "You must listen. You cannot marry. I forbid it. Do you hear? I forbid it. You shall renounce the crown, and in reward I grant you exile, but if you refuse, you shall die." He tried to calm me, but I was roused at last, and drawing my long knife barred his way. Then I told him how they would find Dr. Archer in the cellar with his throat open, and I laughed in his face when I thought of Vanston his knife and the order signed by me. You are king," I cried, "but I shall be king. Who are you to me to keep me from empire over all of the habitable earth? I was born the cousin of a king, but I shall be king." Lewis stood white and rigid before me. Suddenly a man came running up 4th Street, entered the gate of the Lethal Temple, traversed the path of the bronze doors at full speed and plunged into the death chamber with a cry of one demented, and I laughed until I wept tears, but I had recognised Vance and knew that Hubert and his daughter were no longer in my way. Go, I cried to Lewis. You have ceased to be a menace. You will never marry Constance now, and if you marry anyone else in your exile, I will visit you as I did my doctor last night. Mr. Wilde takes charge of you tomorrow. Then I turned and darted into South Fifth Avenue, and with a quiet cry of terror, Lewis dropped his belt and sabre and followed me like the wind. I heard him close behind me at the corner of Bleecker Street, and I dashed into the doorway under Hubert's sign. He cried, "Halt or I fire!" But when he saw that I flew up the stairs, leaving Hubert shocked below, he left me, and I heard him hammering and shouting at the door as though it was possible to arouse the dead. Mr. Wilde's door was open, and I entered, crying, "It is done, it is done, let the nations rise and look upon their king." But I could not find Mr. Wilde, so I went to the cabinet and took the splendid diadem from its case. Then I drew on the white silk robe embroidered with the yellow sign and placed the crown on my head. At last I was king, king by my right in Hasta. King because I knew the mystery of the Hades, and my mind had sounded the depths of the Lake of Hali. I was king. The first grey pencillings of dawn would rise a tempest which would shake 2 hemispheres. Then, as I stood, my every nerve pitched the highest tension, faint with the joy and splendour of my thought, without in the dark passage a man groaned. I seized the tallow dip and sprang to the door. The cat passed me like a demon, the tallow dip went out, my long knife flew swifter than she, and I heard her screech, and I knew that my knife had found her. For a moment I listened to the tumbling and thumping about in the darkness, and then when her frenzy ceased, I lighted a lamp and raised it over my head. Mr. Wilde lay on the floor with his throat torn open. At first I thought he was dead, but as I looked, a green sparkle came into his sunken eyes. His mutilated hand trembled, and then a spasm stretched his mouth from ear to ear. For a moment my terror and despair gave way to hope, but as I bent over him, his eyeballs rolled clean over in his head, and he died. Then, while I stood, transfixed with rage and despair, seeing my crown, my empire, my every hope and ambition, my very life lying prostrate there with the dead master, they came, seized me from behind and bound me until my veins stood like cords. My voice failed with the paroxysms of my frenzied screams. But I still raged, bleeding and infuriating among them, and more than one policeman kept about my sharp teeth. Then, when I could no longer move, they came nearer. I saw old Hubert, and behind him my cousin Lewis's ghastly face, and further away in the corner a woman, Constance, weeping softly. "Ah, I see it now," I shrieked. "You have seized the throne and the empire. Woe, woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the king in yellow." Editor's note: Mr. Castaigne died yesterday in the asylum for criminal insane. And that's where we're going to leave off at the 2-hour mark, because that is actually quite a lot of reading, and my jaw is sort of hurting a little bit. What I could do with a break. Thank you for everyone that stopped by with that little reading stream we did. Hopefully it was entertaining and possibly comfy. And I hope you're enjoying the books that we read. I do hope to do some more of these in the near future. Maybe once a week or so. See if we can't at least get to the end of The King in Yellow and then see where we go from there. But until then, we're going to be seeing who is streaming right now. We're going to take a raid over to them. Let's have a look, see here. Let's have a look, see here. And I see Rowie is streaming, so I'm going to go say hello. So thank you for joining in. Rowie is streaming, so I'm going to go say hello. Thank you for staying in while we read. Thank you, and hopefully we'll see you all next time for the continuation and the second chapter of the story. We'll see you all next time for the continuation and the second chapter of the story.